The summer of 1881 brought more than scorching heat to the dusty cattle town of Redwood Creek, Montana Territory. It brought a woman whose quiet strength would transform the life of the most unlikely man in 3 counties, uncovering secrets buried deeper than any mine shaft and worth more than all the cattle drives combined. What started as the most humiliating public auction in the territory's history would reveal a conspiracy of greed, a fortune in hidden treasure, and prove that sometimes the greatest discoveries come from the most unexpected partnerships. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden platform, erected in the center of Redwood Creek's main street, where a crowd had gathered for what most considered entertainment rather than serious business. Jacob Morrison stood at the edge of the gathering, his substantial frame making him impossible to miss, despite his obvious desire to remain inconspicuous. At 320 pounds, Jacob had grown accustomed to being the subject of whispered conversations and poorly concealed stares, but today the attention felt particularly cruel. The auctioneer, a thin man named Pete Williams who seemed to relish his role in the day's proceedings, called for order among the assembled townspeople. Citizens of Redwood Creek, we have here today several young ladies seeking matrimonial arrangements with respectable men of our community. The bidding will commence at $5 for each prospective bride. Jacob watched from his position near the general store as one by one women were presented to the crowd like livestock at a county fair. Most were quickly claimed by eager bachelors willing to pay substantial sums for companionship and domestic assistance. The amounts called out by bidders ranged from $15 to $30, representing significant investments for working men in a frontier community where cash money remained scarce. Then she appeared. Running Bear, as the auctioneer announced her, stepped onto the platform with a dignity that seemed to transform the crude wooden structure into something approaching sacred ground. Her Sioux heritage was evident in her features and bearing, though she wore the simple calico dress and braided hairstyle that territorial authorities required of all Native Americans living in white settlements. What struck Jacob most powerfully was not her appearance, which was quietly beautiful in a way that needed no embellishment, but her eyes. Those dark eyes surveyed the crowd with intelligence and assessment rather than the desperate hope or resigned fear displayed by the other women. She seemed to be evaluating the assembled men as much as they were evaluating her, searching for something specific among the faces that stared back at her with varying degrees of interest, suspicion, and outright hostility. "Now then," Williams continued, his voice taking on a different tone as he gestured toward Running Bear, "here we have a Sioux woman, age approximately 25, experienced in household duties and outdoor work. The bidding will start at $5. The silence that followed was deafening. Jacob could feel the discomfort rippling through the crowd as men who had been eager to bid on white women suddenly found reasons to examine their boots or engage in whispered conversations with their neighbors. The prejudice was as thick as the dust kicked up by wagon wheels on the dry street. $5, Williams repeated, his voice betraying slight desperation as he realized his auction was about to become a public embarrassment. "Do I hear $5 for this perfectly capable woman?" More silence. Jacob felt anger building in his chest, not just at the obvious racism being displayed, but at the casual cruelty of reducing any human being to a commodity that apparently nobody wanted. Running Bear stood motionless on the platform, her expression unchanged, but Jacob caught a flicker of something in her eyes that might have been hurt before it was quickly replaced by steely determination. $4 then, Williams called, sweat beginning to show on his forehead despite the morning coolness. Surely someone will offer $4. The crowd began to shift restlessly, some people starting to drift away as the entertainment value of the auction diminished. Jacob realized that Running Bear was about to suffer the ultimate humiliation of being rejected entirely, left standing on the platform like unwanted merchandise at a failed sale. $3, Williams tried again, his voice now carrying obvious embarrassment at the situation he had created. Jacob found himself stepping forward before he consciously decided to move. His massive frame parted the crowd like a ship cutting through water as he approached the platform. Every eye turned toward him, and he could hear the murmurs beginning. Immediately, look at Morrison thinking he can buy himself a woman. Even an Indian woman deserves better than that fat fool. Going to take more than $2 to make that arrangement work. The comments stung, but Jacob had endured worse throughout his adult life. What mattered now was preventing a decent woman from being humiliated simply because of prejudice and ignorance. He reached into his pocket and withdrew his worn leather wallet, extracting 2 crumpled dollar bills. $2, he called out in a voice loud enough to carry across the entire gathering. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Williams looked surprised, then relieved that someone had finally made a bid, regardless of how low it was. $2 from Jacob Morrison. Do I hear $2.50? The silence returned, more pointed now that someone had actually bid. Jacob could feel dozens of eyes boring into him, could hear the whispered conversations growing more animated. He knew that by making this bid, he was subjecting himself to ridicule that would follow him for months, possibly years. But looking up at Running Bear, seeing the quiet strength in her posture and the intelligence in her eyes, he knew he could not walk away. $2 going once, Williams announced, clearly eager to conclude this awkward portion of his auction. Going twice. Sold to Jacob Morrison for $2. The crowd erupted in a mixture of laughter, jeering comments, and general commotion as Jacob climbed the steps to the platform. Up close, Running Bear was even more striking than she had appeared from a distance. Her skin had the warm copper tone that spoke of outdoor work and prairie sunshine, and her hair, though braided in the required style, showed hints of natural wave that suggested it would be beautiful when allowed to flow freely. More importantly, when their eyes met directly, Jacob saw intelligence there that reminded him of his late mother, who had been the smartest person he had ever known, despite never having the opportunity for formal education. "Thank you, Running Bear," said quietly, her voice carrying just the trace of an accent that added music to her words. "I am grateful for your kindness." Jacob nodded awkwardly, suddenly uncertain about what came next. The auction had been conducted according to territorial law, which meant they were now legally bound in a matrimonial arrangement that could be formalized by any territorial judge. But standing there on the platform with all of Redwood Creek staring at them, Jacob realized he had acted on impulse without considering the practical implications of his decision. "Ma'am," he said formally, "I want you to know that this arrangement comes with no expectations beyond providing you with safe shelter and honest work. You are free to leave whenever you choose, and I will ask nothing of you that you are not willing to give freely." Running Bear studied his face carefully, as though trying to determine whether his words could be trusted. What she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded once and said, "I accept your offer, Jacob Morrison. I will work hard and cause you no trouble." As they climbed down from the platform together, Jacob could hear the crowd beginning to disperse, their entertainment concluded. But he also heard continued comments about his appearance, his prospects, and the unlikely nature of the arrangement. He had just entered. Let them talk, he thought. He had learned long ago that people would always find reasons to criticize what they did not understand. The walk to his ranch house took 20 minutes along a dusty road that wound between scrub, brush, and scattered cottonwood trees. Jacob owned one of the larger spreads in the area, 3,000 acres of decent grazing land that supported nearly 800 head of cattle. The house itself was substantial, but showed signs of bachelor neglect, with a porch that needed painting and windows that required a woman's touch to make them truly clean. Running Bear walked beside him in silence, carrying the small bundle that apparently contained all her worldly possessions. Jacob wanted to make conversation, but found himself tongue-tied, uncertain what topics would be appropriate or welcome. His experience with women was limited to brief interactions with shopkeepers and the occasional social gathering where his size and awkward manner made him feel more like an unwelcome intruder than a potential suitor. "This is home," he said finally as they approached the house. "It is not much to look at, but it is solid and warm in winter." Running Bear surveyed the property with eyes that missed nothing. She noted the well-maintained fences, the sturdy construction of the outbuildings, and the general air of prosperity that surrounded the operation. Whatever else Jacob Morrison might be, he was clearly a successful rancher who took pride in his work. "You have built something good here," she observed, her first unsolicited comment since leaving town. "The land is happy." Jacob was not sure what she meant by land being happy, but something in her tone suggested it was a compliment. Inside the house, Running Bear continued her quiet assessment while Jacob showed her the main rooms. The kitchen was functional but sparse, lacking the touches that made a house feel like a home. The sitting room contained sturdy furniture arranged without any consideration for comfort or aesthetics. Everything was clean but utilitarian, the domain of a man who saw his house as shelter rather than sanctuary. "I can cook and clean and mend," Running Bear said matter-of-factly. "I can also work with cattle and horses if needed. My people taught me many useful skills before I came to live among whites." Jacob nodded gratefully. "That would be helpful. I can pay you fair wages for whatever work you choose to do, plus room and board naturally." Running Bear shook her head. "We are married now according to white law. I do not expect wages from my husband." The word husband hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither seemed prepared to address directly. Jacob felt heat rise in his face as he contemplated the gap between legal reality and practical possibility. He had never imagined any woman would willingly share his name, much less his life, and the thought that this intelligent, capable woman now bore his surname felt both overwhelming and impossible. "Perhaps we should start as partners," he suggested carefully. "See how well we work together before we worry about other arrangements." Running Bear smiled for the first time since he had met her, expression that transformed her face and made Jacob catch his breath with its warmth. "That is wise," she agreed. "Partnership must come before everything else." Over the following days, Jacob discovered that Running Bear was everything she had claimed to be and more. She attacked the household neglect with systematic efficiency, transforming his bachelor quarters into something approaching a real home. But more than that, she demonstrated knowledge of ranch work that surprised him with its depth and practicality. She could read cattle behavior in ways that helped him identify sick animals before symptoms became obvious. She knew which grasses provided the best nutrition for different seasons, and which water sources would remain reliable during dry spells. Most remarkably, she seemed to understand the rhythms of the land itself in ways that allowed her to predict weather changes, seasonal patterns with uncanny accuracy. "Where did you learn so much about ranching?" Jacob asked one evening as they sat on the porch after completing the day's work. "My father was a warrior, but my grandfather was a keeper of horses," Running Bear explained. "He taught me that animals and land speak to those who know how to listen. White men often forget that cattle are still wild creatures who remember the old ways of living on grass and following water." Jacob found himself looking forward to these conversations more than he had anticipated. Running Bear's perspective on familiar subjects opened new ways of thinking about problems he had been approaching the same way for years. She suggested improvements to his grazing rotation that increased the carrying capacity of his land. She identified mineral deficiencies in his cattle that were easily corrected, but had been reducing their growth rates. Most importantly, she helped him see his ranch as a living system rather than simply a business operation. But as the weeks passed, Jacob began to notice something troubling. Running Bear often paused in her work to stare toward the northern hills, her expression becoming distant and thoughtful. She would stand motionless for minutes at a time, as though listening for sounds that only she could hear. When he asked about these moments, she would simply shake her head and return to whatever task she had been performing. The mystery deepened when Jacob discovered her making what appeared to be maps using charcoal and pieces of bark. The drawings showed geographical features that he recognized from the surrounding territory, but they included details and markings that made no sense to him. When he inquired about them, Running Bear quickly put the materials away and changed the subject. It was not until late September that Jacob learned the truth behind her secretive behavior. They were moving cattle to winter pasture when Running Bear suddenly stopped her horse and pointed toward a distinctive rock formation on a distant ridge. "My grandmother is buried near those rocks," she said quietly. "Before she died, she told me something that I have never shared with anyone." Jacob waited patiently for her to continue, sensing that whatever she was about to reveal carried great significance. "She told me about gold," Running Bear continued, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind through the grass. "Gold that was hidden by my people when the soldiers came to force us onto the reservation. Gold that was meant to buy freedom for those who would never live to see it." The words sent a chill through Jacob that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Stories of hidden Native American treasure were common throughout the territory, usually dismissed as frontier folklore designed to attract gullible treasure hunters. But the way Running Bear spoke, with quiet certainty rather than dramatic excitement, suggested that her knowledge was far more substantial than mere legend. "How much gold?" he asked carefully. "Enough to buy back all the land the government stole," she replied. "Enough to make any man rich beyond his dreams. But it comes with a price." "What kind of price?" "The price of honoring those who died to hide it. The price of using it for something worthy of their sacrifice." Jacob absorbed this information while trying to understand its implications for their partnership. If Running Bear truly knew the location of a significant gold cache, it explained her willingness to marry a stranger for $2. She had not been seeking rescue from poverty or desperation. She had been looking for someone she could trust with a secret that could change both their lives forever. That evening, as they sat beside the fireplace in what had become their customary end-of-day ritual, Running Bear told him the full story her grandmother had shared during those final weeks before her death on the reservation. The gold had been accumulated over decades through trading relationships with Mexican merchants and American trappers who valued Native American guides and interpreters. When territorial conflicts intensified and it became clear that traditional ways of life were ending, tribal leaders had hidden their accumulated wealth in locations known only to a few trusted individuals. Running Bear's grandmother had been one of those trusted keepers, responsible for remembering not just the location of one cache, but the complex system of landmarks and seasonal indicators that marked multiple hiding places throughout the northern territories. She had passed this knowledge to Running Bear with instructions to use it only when the time was right and only with someone who could be trusted to honor the memory of those who had died protecting it. "Why me?" Jacob asked when she finished her account. "Why trust someone you barely know with something so important?" "Because you were the only man who saw me as a person worth $2 when everyone else saw nothing worth any price at all." Running Bear replied simply, "Because you offered me partnership instead of ownership. Because your heart is good even if your body carries extra weight." Her words touched something deep in Jacob's chest that had been wounded by years of rejection and ridicule. He had grown accustomed to being valued only for his money or his capacity for hard work, Never for the person he was beneath the physical appearance that drew so much unwanted attention. "What do you want to do with this information?" he asked. "I want to recover what belongs to my people and use it to build something that honors their memory," she answered. "But I cannot do it alone. I need a partner who understands that some things are more valuable than money." Jacob stared into the fire, contemplating the magnitude of what she was proposing. Recovering hidden treasure would require careful planning, significant resources, and absolute secrecy. More importantly, it would mean accepting responsibility for wealth that carried the weight of history and the obligation to use it wisely. But looking at Running Bear, seeing the trust in her eyes and understanding the courage it had taken for her to share her family's most guarded secret, Jacob knew that his answer had been determined the moment he bid $2 for a woman nobody else wanted. "I will help you," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes, wherever it leads, we will do this together." Running Bear smiled, the same transformative expression that had first captured his attention. But now it carried additional warmth that spoke of genuine affection rather than simple gratitude. "Then tomorrow we begin planning," she said. "Because winter is coming, and spring will be our only chance to reach the hiding place before others start to wonder why we are spending so much time in the northern hills." As Jacob banked the fire and prepared for sleep, he reflected on how completely his life had changed since that humiliating morning at the auction. He had bid $2 for a companion and discovered a partner. He had offered shelter to a woman with nowhere else to go and found someone who could transform his house into a home. Most remarkably, he had stumbled into a treasure hunt that would test everything he thought he knew about courage, loyalty, and the true meaning of wealth. Outside, autumn wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, carrying the scent of coming winter and the promise of adventures that would challenge both of them in ways they could not yet imagine. But inside their house, Jacob Morrison and Running Bear Morrison sat together in comfortable silence, two unlikely partners bound by more than legal ceremony, planning a quest that would either make them rich beyond dreams or destroy everything they had begun to build together. The treasure was real, hidden somewhere in the vast wilderness of Montana Territory. But finding it would require more than maps and determination. It would require trust, courage, and the kind of partnership that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Tomorrow they would begin the most dangerous adventure of their lives. But tonight they were simply two people who had found in each other something more valuable than gold. Something worth risking everything to protect and preserve. October. Winds carried the first hint of winter across the Montana Territory as Jacob and Running Bear began their careful preparations for what would become the most dangerous endeavor either had ever attempted. The morning after Running Bear revealed her grandmother's secret, they sat at the kitchen table with coffee and crude maps spread between them, planning an expedition that would take them deep into territory controlled by hostile forces far more dangerous than any wild animal. Running Bear traced her finger along a hand-drawn route that wound through treacherous mountain passes and across rivers that could become impassable within hours if weather conditions changed. "The cache is located here," she explained, pointing to a spot where three valleys converged near a distinctive peak shaped like a sleeping bear. "My grandmother called it the place where eagles rest because golden eagles nested in the cliff faces every spring." Jacob studied the terrain features she had sketched, comparing them to his own knowledge of the northern wilderness. "That is at least 4 days hard riding from here, possibly longer if we encounter bad weather or difficult river crossings. We would need pack animals, supplies for at least 2 weeks, and equipment for excavating whatever your people buried. More than that," Running Bear added quietly, "we would need a believable reason for traveling into that region. The Army patrols those areas regularly, looking for Indians who have left the reservation without permission. If they find us digging around sacred burial sites, they will ask questions we cannot answer honestly." The challenge was more complex than simple logistics. The territory where the gold was hidden fell within boundaries that the federal government Considered sensitive due to ongoing tensions with various Native American tribes who refused to accept reservation life. Military patrols, territorial marshals, and civilian militia groups all maintained regular surveillance of the region, making unauthorized treasure hunting extremely risky. "We need a cover story," Jacob concluded. "Some legitimate reason for being in that area that would satisfy official curiosity without raising suspicions about our real purpose." Running Bear had been considering this problem since childhood, when her grandmother first shared the secret that had shaped her entire life. "I think we should become surveyors," she suggested. "The territorial government is always commissioning surveys for new railroad routes, mining claims, and homestead boundaries. Surveyors travel everywhere and spend long periods in remote locations without attracting unwanted attention." Jacob nodded slowly as he considered the possibilities. Surveying would indeed provide perfect cover for their expedition, but it would also require technical knowledge and equipment that neither of them currently possessed. "I know something about land measurement from establishing ranch boundaries, but not enough to convince professional scrutiny. We would need to learn surveying techniques and acquire proper instruments." "I can learn," Running Bear said with quiet confidence. "My people have always been skilled at reading land and understanding how terrain connects across great distances. The tools are just ways of making permanent records of knowledge we already carry in our hearts and minds." Over the following weeks, they threw themselves into mastering the basics of territorial surveying. Jacob purchased technical manuals from the general store in Redwood Creek, while Running Bear practiced with a compass and measuring chain borrowed from the county clerk's office. They spent hours tramping across Jacob's ranch, creating detailed maps of fence lines, water sources, and topographical features. The learning process revealed surprising talents in both of them. Jacob discovered that his methodical approach to ranch management translated well to the precise measurements required for accurate surveying. Running Bear demonstrated an intuitive understanding of geographical relationships that allowed her to predict how terrain would change beyond the range of immediate observation. But more importantly, working together on this shared project deepened their partnership in ways that surprised them both. The legal marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement slowly evolved into genuine affection based on mutual respect and common purpose. They developed systems of nonverbal communication that allowed them to coordinate complex tasks without discussion. They learned to anticipate each other's needs and responses in ways that made them function as a seamlessly integrated team. The transformation was not lost on the residents of Redwood Creek, who had initially viewed their unusual marriage with skepticism and amusement. When Jacob and Running Bear appeared in town together, it became obvious that something real had developed between them. Running Bear's quiet dignity commanded respect even from those who harbored prejudices against Native Americans. Jacob's newfound confidence made him seem less like an object of ridicule and more like a man comfortable with his place in the world. Martha Peterson, who ran the boarding house and served as the town's unofficial source of social commentary, made an observation that captured the general sentiment. "That Morrison woman has done something remarkable for poor Jacob. He carries himself different now, like he knows he belongs somewhere." The comment was more accurate than Martha realized. For the first time in his adult life, Jacob felt genuinely valued by someone whose opinion mattered to him. Running Bear's quiet faith in his abilities had restored confidence that years of rejection and ridicule had gradually eroded. When she looked at him, she saw a capable partner rather than an overweight failure, and that perception was slowly changing how he saw himself. By November, they had acquired sufficient surveying skills and equipment to begin planning their expedition in earnest. Jacob purchased a high-quality compass, measuring chains, and mapping instruments that would allow them to create professional-looking survey reports. Running Bear practiced using the equipment until she could take accurate measurements quickly and efficiently. More challenging was developing a plausible reason for surveying the specific area where the treasure was hidden. The territorial government maintained records of all official survey commissions, making it dangerous to claim authorization they did not actually possess. They needed some legitimate purpose that would justify their presence in the region without requiring official paperwork that could be easily verified. The solution came from an unexpected source. Daniel Hayes, a traveling merchant who supplied ranch equipment throughout the territory, stopped at Jacob's ranch in late November with information that changed everything about their planning. Heard tell the Northern Pacific Railroad is looking to extend their line through Montana territory, Hayes mentioned during dinner at Jacob's invitation. They need survey information about potential routes through the northern mountains, but the company does not want to pay for official territorial surveys until they know which routes are actually feasible. Running Bear and Jacob exchanged careful glances, recognizing immediately how this information could serve their purposes. Private railroad companies often commissioned unofficial surveys to gather preliminary information before investing in expensive official studies. Such arrangements were common and perfectly legal, providing exactly the cover story they needed. How would someone get involved in that kind of work? Jacob asked casually. Company representatives are staying at the Grand Hotel in Helena, Hayes replied. They are interviewing anyone with surveying experience who might be interested in independent contract work. Pay is supposed to be quite good, especially for teams willing to work in difficult terrain during winter months. Jacob felt excitement building in his chest, but forced himself to maintain a casual tone. Might be worth looking into. Running Bear and I have been practicing surveying techniques, and we could use some additional income during the slow season. After Hayes departed the next morning, Jacob and Running Bear spent the day refining their plan. If they could obtain a genuine contract from the Northern Pacific Railroad, even for preliminary survey work, they would have perfect documentation to justify their presence in the treasure location. The railroad would expect them to spend weeks in remote areas, taking measurements and creating maps that would naturally require them to explore exactly the terrain where Running Bear's grandmother had hidden the tribal gold. The journey to Helena took 3 days through increasingly difficult weather that reminded them both how challenging their real expedition would become once winter settled over the northern mountains. Snow had begun falling regularly and temperatures dropped, well below freezing during the night hours. But the discomfort was worth enduring for the opportunity to establish legitimate credentials for their treasure hunting mission. Helena was unlike any town either of them had ever visited. As the territorial capital, it attracted business representatives, government officials, and entrepreneurs from throughout the region. The Grand Hotel was genuinely grand, with carpeted floors, gas lighting, and dining facilities that rivaled anything available in established eastern cities. Running Bear drew curious stares as they entered the hotel lobby, but her dignified bearing and Jacob's obvious respectability seemed to satisfy most observers that they belonged in such sophisticated surroundings. Jacob had purchased a new suit for the occasion, while Running Bear wore a traveling dress that struck the perfect balance between fashion and practicality. The Northern Pacific representatives were indeed interviewing potential surveyors, and their requirements aligned perfectly with Jacob and Running Bear's capabilities. The railroad needed teams willing to work in remote mountainous terrain during winter months, creating preliminary maps of potential routes that official survey crews could refine during more favorable seasons. William Crawford, the lead representative, was a middle-aged man with the sharp eyes and direct manner of someone accustomed to evaluating people quickly and accurately. He reviewed their sample maps and questioned them extensively about their experience with winter travel and mountain surveying techniques. Most teams are reluctant to work in truly remote areas during winter months, Crawford explained. The conditions are harsh, the isolation can be dangerous, and there is always risk of being cut off by severe weather. But those are precisely the areas where we need preliminary information before committing to expensive official surveys. Jacob and Running Bear assured him that they were prepared for difficult conditions and extended isolation. Their ranch experience had taught them both to function effectively in harsh weather, and they genuinely preferred working away from towns where Running Bear's Native American heritage might create unnecessary complications. Crawford was particularly impressed by Running Bear's intuitive understanding of terrain relationships and her ability to predict how geographical features would connect across areas they had not yet explored. "This woman has a natural gift for reading land," he told Jacob. Privately, "I have worked with professional surveyors who could not match her instinctive understanding of how mountain systems fit together." After 2 days of interviews and technical discussions, Crawford offered them a contract that exceeded their wildest expectations. The Northern Pacific Railroad would pay them $50 per week, plus expenses for conducting preliminary surveys of 3 potential routes through the northern Montana Territory. The work would begin in January and continue through March, providing exactly the time frame they needed for locating and recovering the hidden treasure. More importantly, the contract included detailed maps of the areas they were expected to survey, and one of those areas encompassed the valley where Running Bear's grandmother had hidden the tribal gold. They would have legitimate business reasons for spending weeks in that precise location, with railroad documentation to satisfy any official inquiries about their activities. The return journey to their ranch was filled with excited planning and careful preparation for the challenges ahead. They now had official cover for their treasure hunting expedition, but they also had genuine surveying responsibilities that would require careful management. The railroad expected detailed maps and technical reports that would influence major business decisions about route selection and construction costs. "We must do the survey work properly," Running Bear insisted, as they rode through snow-covered hills toward home. "The railroad is trusting us with important responsibilities, and we cannot betray that trust, even if our primary purpose is different from what they expect." Jacob agreed completely. Their contract with the Northern Pacific Railroad provided perfect cover for treasure hunting, but it also created genuine obligations that had to be fulfilled professionally. They would have to balance their secret mission with legitimate surveying work, creating real value for their employer while pursuing their own goals. December was devoted to final preparations for what would become the most important expedition of their lives. Jacob purchased winter camping equipment, additional pack animals, and specialized tools that could serve both surveying and excavation purposes. Running Bear spent hours studying her grandmother's detailed descriptions of the cache location, memorizing landmarks and seasonal indicators that would be crucial for finding the exact burial site. They also worked to strengthen their partnership through intensive practice with surveying techniques and winter survival skills. The expedition would test their relationship under conditions of extreme stress, isolation, and physical hardship. Success would require absolute trust and seamless cooperation between 2 people who had known each other for only a few months. The process revealed depths of character in both of them that might never have emerged under ordinary circumstances. Jacob's gentle nature and methodical approach to problem solving made him an ideal partner for the patient work of accurate surveying. Running Bear's intuitive understanding of natural systems and her deep connection to the land provided insights that no formal training could duplicate. But beyond their complementary skills, they discovered genuine affection that had grown from mutual respect and shared purpose. The legal marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement was evolving into something deeper and more meaningful than either had dared to hope. Christmas Eve found them sitting by their fireplace, reviewing maps and supply lists one final time before beginning their journey to the northern treasure site. Outside, snow fell steadily, creating the kind of winter wonderland that looked beautiful from inside a warm house, but would present serious challenges for travelers in the wilderness. "Are you afraid?" Running Bear asked quietly as they studied the route they would follow to reach the cache location. Jacob considered the question carefully. He was concerned about the physical dangers they would face, worried about their ability to fulfill their surveying obligations while pursuing treasure-hunting goals, and anxious about the consequences if their secret mission was discovered by authorities, who would not understand their motivations. But afraid was not the right word for what he felt. Excited, challenged, and deeply committed to their shared enterprise, but not afraid. Running Bear's quiet confidence had given him faith in their ability to succeed against whatever obstacles they might encounter. "I am concerned about making mistakes that could hurt you," he replied honestly. "But I am not afraid of the adventure itself. Whatever happens, we will face it together." Running Bear smiled and reached across the table to take his hand, a gesture that still surprised him with its warmth and naturalness. "My grandmother always said that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear for something that matters more than personal safety." "What matters more than safety to you?" Jacob asked. "Justice for my people, proof that their sacrifices meant something, and our partnership, which has become more precious to me than any treasure we might find in those mountains." Her words touched something deep in Jacob's heart that had been dormant since childhood. He had never imagined that anyone would value his partnership as much as Running Bear seemed to, and the knowledge that she trusted him with her family's most sacred secret filled him with determination to prove worthy of that trust. "Tomorrow we begin," he said quietly. "Whatever we find in those mountains, whatever challenges we face, we will meet them as partners in every sense of the word." Running Bear squeezed his hand gently and nodded. "Tomorrow we begin the most important journey of our lives. But tonight we are home together, and that is treasure enough for any heart to hold." As they prepared for sleep, both Jacob and Running Bear understood that their lives were about to change in ways they could not predict or control. The treasure hunt would test their courage, their skills, and their commitment to each other under conditions that would reveal their true characters. Success could make them wealthy beyond imagination, but failure might cost them everything they had built together. But lying in their separate bedrooms, listening to winter wind whistle through the cottonwood trees outside, both of them felt a deep certainty that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together as true partners. The legal marriage that had begun with a $2 bid at a humiliating auction had become something real and lasting, strong enough to survive whatever trials awaited them in the northern wilderness. The treasure was waiting, hidden in mountains that had guarded its secret for decades. Soon they would begin the journey that would either fulfill Running Bear's grandmother's dying wish or destroy everything they had risked to achieve. But tonight, they were simply two people who had found in each other something more valuable than gold, something worth any risk to protect and preserve. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering their ranch in pristine white that would soon be disturbed by the tracks of pack animals and riders heading north toward adventure, danger, and the possibility of discovering riches that could change the course of their lives forever. The second act of their story was ending, but the greatest challenges and the most extraordinary discoveries still lay ahead, waiting for them in the frozen wilderness of Montana Territory. The January wind cut through the Montana wilderness like a blade forged from winter itself as Jacob and Running Bear guided their pack train through snowdrifts that reached the bellies of their horses. 3 weeks into their expedition, they had covered nearly 200 miles of treacherous mountain terrain, officially surveying potential railroad routes, while secretly searching for landmarks that would lead them to the hidden treasure cache. Running Bear rode ahead, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for geographical features that matched her grandmother's detailed descriptions. The old woman had possessed a remarkable memory for terrain, able to recall the exact shape of distant peaks and the precise angle at which seasonal streams flowed through narrow valleys. But translating those decades-old memories into current reality required skills that pushed Running Bear's abilities to their absolute limits. The peak shaped like a sleeping bear should be visible from this valley, she called back to Jacob, who was struggling to keep their heavily loaded pack animals moving through the deep snow. According to grandmother's directions, we should see it when the sun reaches its highest point. Jacob checked his pocket watch and estimated they had perhaps 2 hours before noon. The pace they had maintained since leaving their base camp 3 days earlier was exhausting for both humans and animals, but necessary if they hoped to reach the cache location before weather conditions forced them to retreat to lower elevations. Their official surveying work had proceeded smoothly, allowing them to create detailed maps that would satisfy the Northern Pacific Railroad's requirements while providing perfect cover for their treasure hunting activities. Jacob had discovered a genuine talent for the technical aspects of surveying, while Running Bear's intuitive understanding of terrain relationships had proven invaluable for predicting how geographical features connected across vast distances. But the dual nature of their mission created constant tension between conflicting priorities. Every hour spent on legitimate railroad survey work was time not devoted to searching for the tribal treasure. Every deviation from their official route to explore promising terrain risked raising questions about their true purpose that they were not prepared to answer. The morning sun climbed higher through clouds that threatened another snowstorm as they crested a ridge that overlooked a broad valley dotted with frozen streams and stands of snow-laden pine trees. Running Bear reined in her horse and pointed toward the northern horizon where a distinctive mountain peak rose above the surrounding summits. "There," she said quietly, her voice carrying the reverence of someone viewing a sacred site. The Sleeping Bear Mountain that grandmother described so many times during those final weeks before her death. Jacob studied the distant peak and immediately understood why Running Bear's ancestors had chosen such a distinctive landmark for their treasure cache. The mountain's profile indeed resembled a massive bear lying on its side, with clearly defined head, shoulders, and haunches that would be recognizable from multiple directions. It was the kind of geographical feature that could serve as a navigation point for generations of travelers familiar with the terrain. "How far do you estimate?" he asked, pulling out his surveying instruments to take precise measurements of distance and direction. "Perhaps 10 miles, Running Bear replied, though the terrain between here and there will be difficult. We must cross 2 river valleys and climb through passes that may be blocked by snowdrifts." Jacob completed his calculations and confirmed Running Bear's estimate. 10 miles of mountain travel in winter conditions could easily require 2 full days, especially with pack animals carrying the equipment they would need for excavating the treasure site. They would have to establish a temporary base camp and make the final approach with minimal supplies. But as they prepared to descend into the valley that would take them toward the Sleeping Bear Mountain, Running Bear suddenly raised her hand in a warning gesture that froze Jacob in place. In the distance, barely visible against the white landscape, a line of riders was moving along a parallel ridge approximately 2 miles to the east. Cavalry patrol, Jacob identified after studying the distant figures through his surveying telescope. 8 men, moving in standard military formation toward the north. Running Bear's face had gone pale with concern that extended beyond simple worry about official interference with their mission. Army patrols in this region were specifically tasked with preventing unauthorized Native Americans from traveling outside reservation boundaries. If the soldiers discovered Running Bear in traditional tribal territory, they might assume she was attempting to flee federal custody, regardless of her legal marriage to a white rancher. "We need to avoid contact," she said urgently. "Soldiers ask questions that could expose our real purpose here, and they might not accept that I have legal permission to be in this area." Jacob understood immediately that their situation had become far more dangerous than simple treasure hunting. The political tension surrounding Native American rights in Montana territory meant that any encounter with military authorities could escalate into serious legal problems that would destroy their mission and potentially threaten Running Bear's freedom, Can we change our route to avoid their patrol area? He asked while studying his maps to identify alternative approaches to the treasure site. Running Bear considered the terrain carefully before responding. There's another path that follows the Western Valley system, but it will add at least 2 days to our journey and require crossing areas where avalanches are common during winter months. The choice was between risking military contact that could end their expedition immediately or accepting additional physical dangers that might prove equally destructive to their goals. Jacob weighed the alternatives while watching the distant cavalry patrol continue its methodical sweep of the northern territories. We take the western route, he decided. Better to face natural dangers we can potentially overcome than human complications we cannot control. They spent the remainder of the day backtracking to a position where they could access the Western Valley system without being observed by the military patrol. The detour cost them precious time and forced them to camp in a location that offered minimal protection from the wind that howled through the mountain passes during the night hours. But the delay also provided an unexpected opportunity to refine their understanding of the treasure site location. Running Bear spent the evening reviewing her grandmother's descriptions in light of the actual terrain they had observed, identifying additional landmarks that would guide them to the exact burial location once they reached the Sleeping Bear Mountain. The cache is hidden in a cave system behind a waterfall that flows year-round, she explained while sketching details on a piece of bark using charcoal from their campfire. Grandmother said the cave entrance is concealed by fallen rocks that appear natural but were actually arranged by my people to hide the opening. Jacob studied her crude map and compared it to the topographical features he had observed through his surveying instruments. Finding a waterfall in mountain terrain should not be difficult, but locating one specific cave among dozens of possible hiding places would require extraordinary luck or detailed knowledge that only Running Bear possessed. How will you recognize the correct waterfall? He asked. Mountain regions typically have many streams that form cascades during snowmelt season. The water flows over red rocks that contain flecks of yellow metal, Running Bear replied. Grandmother called it fool's gold because prospectors often mistook it for real treasure and wasted time digging where nothing valuable could be found. Jacob nodded understanding. Iron pyrite formations were common in Montana Territory, and their resemblance to genuine gold had indeed fooled many inexperienced miners into exhausting themselves pursuing worthless deposits. But the distinctive appearance of such formations would make them excellent landmarks for navigation purposes. The second day of their detour through the Western Valley system tested both their endurance and their commitment to the treasure hunting mission. The route Running Bear had chosen led them through terrain that would have been challenging under optimal conditions, but became genuinely dangerous when complicated by winter weather and heavily loaded pack animals. They encountered their first serious obstacle at a river crossing where the current had carved a channel too deep and swift for safe passage. Jacob spent 2 hours searching for an alternative ford, while Running Bear worked to calm pack animals that sensed the danger posed by the rushing water and icy conditions. When they finally located a crossing point where fallen trees provided natural bridges, it required careful coordination to move their entire expedition safely to the opposite bank. Jacob went first, testing each step to ensure the makeshift bridge would support the weight of loaded animals. Running Bear followed with the pack train, talking constantly to keep the horses calm during the precarious crossing. By late afternoon, they had gained sufficient elevation to see the Sleeping Bear Mountain clearly, its distinctive profile now dominating the northern horizon. But they had also encountered weather conditions that threatened to make further progress impossible. Snow was falling heavily, driven by winds that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. We need shelter, Jacob announced after consulting his compass and surveying instruments to confirm their position. The storm is intensifying, and we cannot risk losing our direction in this terrain. Running Bear agreed reluctantly. She was eager to reach the treasure site, but she also understood that pushing forward in dangerous conditions could result in disaster that would end their mission permanently. They established a temporary camp in a grove of pine trees that provided some protection from the wind while they waited for the weather to improve. The forced delay created an opportunity for serious conversation about what they would do if they actually succeeded in locating the tribal treasure. Neither had wanted to discuss the practical implications of finding a fortune in gold while they were still struggling simply to reach the cache location, but the proximity to their goal made such planning unavoidable. If we recover the gold, what then? Jacob asked as they sat beside their small fire, listening to wind howl through the trees around their shelter. We cannot simply appear in town with more wealth than most people see in a lifetime without raising questions about where it came from. Running Bear had been considering this problem since childhood, when her grandmother first shared the secret that had shaped her entire life. The gold must be used carefully in ways that honor those who died to protect it. We cannot simply become rich and forget the responsibilities that come with such wealth. Jacob understood that she was speaking about more than practical concerns regarding sudden prosperity. The treasure represented the accumulated sacrifices of people who had died, defending their way of life against overwhelming odds. Using that wealth for purely personal purposes would constitute a betrayal of their memory and their hopes for the future. What kind of responsibilities? He asked gently. Helping other Native Americans who are struggling to survive on reservations, where the government provides inadequate food and medical care, Running Bear replied without hesitation. Purchasing land where traditional ways of life can be preserved and passed to future generations. Supporting legal efforts to protect tribal rights and sovereignty. Jacob nodded thoughtfully. Those were worthy goals that would require careful planning and substantial resources to achieve effectively. But they would also require operating within legal and political systems that were often hostile to Native American interests, making success extremely difficult regardless of available funding. We would need allies, he observed. People with legal expertise and political connections, who could help us use the money effectively without attracting unwanted attention from authorities who might try to confiscate wealth they claimed belonged to the federal government. That is why I needed a partner I could trust completely, Running Bear said quietly. Someone who could move in white society without suspicion while remaining loyal to our shared goals and values. Her words carried implications that went far beyond treasure hunting or even social justice advocacy. She was describing a lifetime partnership based on shared principles and mutual commitment to causes larger than personal gain. The legal marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement was evolving into something that resembled the traditional tribal partnerships her grandmother had described during those long evenings of storytelling. Jacob felt humbled by the depth of trust Running Bear was placing in him, but also energized by the possibility of using his life for purposes more meaningful than simply accumulating personal wealth through cattle ranching. The treasure hunt had started as an adventure, but it was becoming a mission that could give his existence genuine significance. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind crystalline air and snow conditions that would make travel difficult, but not impossible. They broke camp at dawn and resumed their approach to the Sleeping Bear Mountain, following a route that Running Bear remembered from her grandmother's detailed descriptions of the landscape. As they climbed higher into the mountain terrain, the evidence of human presence became increasingly apparent. They discovered remnants of old campfires, carved symbols on tree trunks, and carefully constructed rock cairns that marked traditional travel routes used by Native American hunting parties for generations before white settlement disrupted their seasonal movements. These signs filled Running Bear with mixed emotions of pride and sadness as she recognized evidence of her people's deep connection to land that was now officially controlled by the federal government. The territory they were crossing had been home to her ancestors for countless generations, And every geographical feature carried cultural significance that was being systematically erased by policies designed to force Native Americans onto distant reservations. But the cultural markers also served practical purposes for their current mission. Her grandmother had incorporated traditional navigation techniques into her directions for finding the treasure cache, using symbols and landmarks that would be meaningful to tribal members while remaining invisible to white prospectors who lacked knowledge of Native American cultural practices. "Look there," Running Bear said suddenly, pointing toward a distinctive arrangement of stones on a ridge above their current position. "That is a trail marker indicating the direction to sacred sites. We are very close now." Jacob studied the stone formation through his surveying telescope and confirmed that it appeared to be artificially constructed rather than a natural geological feature. The rocks were arranged in a pattern that would be clearly visible to travelers approaching from the south, but would blend invisibly into the landscape when viewed from other directions. "How close?" he asked, feeling excitement building despite the exhaustion that had accumulated during their long journey through increasingly difficult terrain. "Less than a mile," Running Bear replied, her voice carrying the reverence appropriate for approaching a site where her ancestors had performed one of their final acts of defiance against forces that would ultimately destroy their traditional way of life. They dismounted and secured their pack animals in a sheltered location before proceeding on foot toward the area where the treasure was supposedly hidden. The terrain became progressively more rugged as they climbed, requiring careful navigation around ice-covered rocks and snow-filled crevices that could easily result in serious injury. But the sound they had been listening for gradually became audible above the wind, the distinctive roar of falling water that indicated they were approaching the waterfall behind which the treasure cave was concealed. Running Bear's pace quickened as she recognized the sound her grandmother had described so many times during those final conversations about the family secret. The waterfall appeared suddenly as they rounded a massive boulder, cascading 30 feet down a cliff face composed of the red rock formations that Running Bear had been taught to recognize. Even in winter conditions, with much of the water frozen into spectacular ice formations, the flow continued strongly enough to keep the stream running beneath a coating of ice. More importantly, Jacob could see flecks of metallic material embedded in the rock face that caught sunlight and reflected it in ways that created an almost magical display of golden sparkles. The iron pyrite formations were exactly as Running Bear had described, distinctive enough to serve as unmistakable landmarks for anyone who knew what to look for. "This is the place," Running Bear said quietly, her voice barely audible above the sound of falling water. "Behind that waterfall, my people hid enough gold to change the course of history for every Native American tribe in the territory." Jacob studied the cliff face carefully, looking for signs of the concealed cave entrance that supposedly lay behind the cascade. The falling water had carved a deep pool at the base of the cliff, now partially frozen but still displaying the characteristic dark color that indicated significant depth. "Getting behind that waterfall will require wading through water that could be over our heads," he observed. "And even if we find the cave entrance, we will need proper equipment to move whatever your people buried there." "I know," Running Bear replied. "Grandmother warned me that recovering the treasure would be the most dangerous part of the entire enterprise. Many people have died in mountain caves when they underestimated the risks involved in underground exploration. But despite the obvious dangers, both of them understood that they had come too far and invested too much to retreat without at least attempting to locate the treasure cache. The gold represented more than simple wealth. It was proof that Running Bear's ancestors had possessed the wisdom and courage to preserve something valuable for future generations, even as their world was being systematically destroyed by forces beyond their control. The afternoon was spent preparing for what would essentially be an underwater cave exploration in conditions that could easily prove fatal if anything went wrong. Jacob constructed a rope system that would allow them to maintain connection with the surface while exploring behind the waterfall. Running Bear gathered materials for torches that would provide light inside the cave while remaining functional despite moisture and cold temperatures. As evening approached, they established a secure camp near the waterfall where they could spend the night before attempting the dangerous cave exploration that would determine whether their entire expedition had been worthwhile. The sound of falling water provided a constant reminder of the challenges they would face, but it also served as evidence that they had successfully followed her grandmother's directions to the exact location where tribal treasure had been hidden decades earlier. Tomorrow would bring either triumph or disaster, but tonight they were simply two partners who had traveled hundreds of miles through wilderness conditions to reach a place where dreams might become reality or illusions might be finally shattered by harsh truth. The treasure was waiting, hidden behind falling water in a cave that might contain enough gold to fulfill every hope Running Bear's grandmother had carried to her grave, or might prove to be empty stone that had protected nothing more substantial than the hopes and fears of people who had died, believing their sacrifices would matter to future generations. Dawn broke gray and cold over the frozen waterfall as Jacob and Running Bear prepared for what they both understood might be the final act of their treasure-hunting expedition. The night had passed slowly, filled with dreams and anxieties about what lay hidden behind the cascade of water that had guarded tribal secrets for more than 20 years. But as morning light illuminated the red rock formations and revealed the full scope of their challenge, both felt a mixture of determination and apprehension that made every movement feel significant. Running Bear knelt beside the equipment they had assembled for cave exploration, checking each piece of rope and examining every torch to ensure they would function properly in the dangerous conditions they were about to enter. Her grandmother's spirit seemed to hover over the preparations, offering silent guidance and protection for the granddaughter who was attempting to fulfill promises made during those final weeks, before death claimed the last keeper of tribal treasure secrets. The water behind this waterfall could be deeper than we can manage, Jacob observed as he studied the dark pool that had formed at the base of the cliff. If the cave entrance is completely submerged, we might not be able to reach it without diving equipment that we do not possess. Running Bear had considered this possibility during the long hours of the previous night, weighing the risks against the importance of at least attempting to recover what her ancestors had died protecting. My grandmother never mentioned diving, she replied thoughtfully. The cache was hidden by people who expected their descendants to be able to retrieve it without drowning. There must be some way to reach the cave that does not require going completely underwater. Jacob nodded, hoping her logic was correct, but understanding that decades of weather changes could have altered water levels significantly since the treasure was first concealed. They would have to explore carefully, testing each step to avoid being swept away by currents or trapped in underwater passages that offered no escape route. The first challenge was simply reaching the area behind the waterfall without being overwhelmed by the force of falling water or losing their footing on rocks made treacherous by constant moisture and freezing temperatures. Jacob secured the safety rope around his waist and began wading into the pool, feeling carefully for stable footing while Running Bear maintained tension on the line that would allow her to pull him back if he encountered serious difficulty. The water was shockingly cold despite the thermal protection provided by their heavy winter clothing. Within moments, Jacob could feel numbness spreading through his legs as the temperature began affecting his circulation and coordination. But he pushed forward, using his hands to feel along the cliff face for any indication of an opening that might lead to the treasure cave. The sound of falling water became overwhelming as he moved closer to the cascade itself, making communication with Running Bear nearly impossible. But his searching hands eventually detected what felt like an irregularity in the rock wall, a depression that might indicate the presence of an opening behind the natural curtain formed by the waterfall. "I found something," he shouted back toward Running Bear, though he was uncertain whether his voice could be heard above the roar of falling water. "It feels like there might be an opening here, but I cannot see anything clearly through all this spray and mist." Running Bear began working her way into the pool to join him, moving carefully but with obvious urgency to reach the area where Jacob had detected signs of the hidden cave entrance. The cold water was equally shocking to her system, but her smaller size allowed her to navigate more easily around the submerged rocks that created obstacles for Jacob's larger frame. When she reached his position, Running Bear immediately began feeling along the cliff face with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what she was looking for. Her grandmother's descriptions had included specific details about the cave entrance that would help distinguish it from natural formations that might appear similar to casual observation. "Here," she said suddenly, her voice filled with excitement despite the difficult conditions they were enduring. "There is definitely an opening behind this curtain of water, and I can feel air movement that suggests the cave extends back into the cliff rather than ending in a shallow depression." Jacob moved to the position Running Bear indicated and confirmed her discovery. His hands detected not just an opening, but what felt like deliberately placed stones that had been arranged to partially conceal the entrance, while still allowing access to anyone who knew the exact location. The work showed clear evidence of human construction rather than natural geological processes. But entering the cave would require passing completely through the waterfall, accepting total soaking in water cold enough to cause hypothermia within minutes if they could not quickly find shelter and warmth inside the hidden chamber. They would have perhaps 10 minutes to locate the treasure and begin their retreat before the cold became life-threatening. "Are you ready?" Jacob asked, understanding that once they committed to entering the cave, they would have no choice to complete their exploration quickly or risk serious injury from exposure to the brutal conditions. Running Bear nodded firmly, her eyes reflecting determination that had been building throughout her entire adult life as she prepared to fulfill the sacred trust her grandmother had placed in her care. "Ready," she replied simply, and together they pushed through the curtain of falling water into the darkness beyond. The cave interior was larger than either had expected, extending back into the cliff far enough that their torchlight could not immediately reveal the rear wall. More importantly, the temperature inside was noticeably warmer than the outdoor conditions, suggesting that the cave system might connect to underground thermal sources that provided natural heating during winter months. But most remarkable was the evidence of human habitation that became visible as their eyes adjusted to the torchlight and they began exploring the chamber systematically. The walls showed clear signs of modification with natural irregularities, smoothed and enlarged to create storage areas and living spaces. Stone shelves had been carved into the rock to hold supplies and personal belongings. Fire pits had been constructed with careful attention to ventilation that would allow smoke to escape without creating dangerous accumulations inside the enclosed space. This was not simply a hiding place for treasure, Jacob realized as he studied the sophisticated modifications that transformed a natural cave into a functional underground shelter. This was a refuge where people could survive for extended periods if necessary, complete with facilities for cooking, sleeping, and storing the supplies needed for long-term occupation. Running Bear was examining a section of the cave wall where symbols had been carved into the stone using traditional tribal techniques that created permanent records of important information. The markings included pictographs that told stories, maps that showed geographical relationships, and what appeared to be inventory lists that cataloged the contents of various storage areas throughout the cave system. "Look at this," she called softly, her voice carrying the reverence appropriate for viewing sacred tribal artifacts. "These symbols tell the story of how my people prepared for the final resistance against the army forces that would drive them onto reservations. This cave was not just a hiding place for gold. It was a command center for coordinating the last efforts to preserve tribal independence. Jacob joined her study of the wall carvings, beginning to understand that they had discovered something far more significant than a simple treasure cache. The cave represented a piece of Native American history that had been preserved exactly as it existed during those final desperate months when tribal leaders were making their last stand against overwhelming military superiority. But their historical appreciation was interrupted by a discovery that made both of them catch their breath with excitement and apprehension. In a natural alcove near the rear of the main chamber, carefully protected by layers of oiled hide and wooden containers, they found the treasure that had drawn them through hundreds of miles of dangerous winter travel. The gold was exactly as Running Bear's grandmother had described it during those final conversations about family secrets and sacred obligations. Coins, nuggets, and raw ore had been accumulated over decades of trading relationships with Mexican merchants, American trappers, and anyone else willing to exchange precious metals for the services and goods that Native American communities could provide. But the quantity exceeded even Running Bear's most optimistic expectations based on her grandmother's descriptions. There was enough gold to purchase substantial acreage of prime agricultural land, fund legal challenges to federal policies that oppressed tribal communities, and support Native American families for years while they established new lives away from the poverty and despair of reservation existence. "How much do you estimate?" Jacob asked as they began the careful process of examining and inventorying the treasure, without disturbing the preservation systems that had protected it for so many years. "More than we could carry in a single trip," Running Bear replied, her voice reflecting amazement at the scope of her ancestors' foresight and preparation. They must have been accumulating this wealth for generations, saving everything they could against the day when it would be needed to preserve what remained of tribal culture and independence. But their examination of the treasure was suddenly interrupted by sounds from outside the cave that froze both of them in positions of absolute silence and terror. Voices were approaching the waterfall area, multiple speakers engaged in conversation that suggested the presence of several people rather than casual travelers passing through the remote mountain location. Soldiers, Jacob identified after listening carefully to the cadence and vocabulary being used by the approaching speakers. At least 4 men, possibly more, and they seemed to be conducting some kind of systematic search of the area rather than simply traveling through. Running Bear's face went pale as she understood the implications of military presence at their treasure site. If soldiers discovered their cave exploration activities, they would face questions about their purpose in the region that could expose their entire mission and result in confiscation of the tribal gold under federal laws that claimed authority over all Native American cultural artifacts. "Can we remain hidden until they leave?" she whispered, though both of them understood that their horses and equipment were visible in the camp they had established near the waterfall. Any competent search would reveal clear evidence of their presence in the area. The voices outside were becoming clearer as the speakers approached the immediate vicinity of the waterfall, and Jacob began to distinguish individual words that revealed the purpose of their visit to this remote location. The soldiers were not conducting a routine patrol. They were specifically searching for Jacob and Running Bear based on information that someone had provided about their treasure hunting activities. Morrison and the Indian woman were reported heading toward this area 3 days ago. One voice announced clearly enough for Jacob to understand, despite the background noise created by the falling water. "If they are conducting unauthorized archaeological excavations, we have orders to arrest them and confiscate any materials they have removed from federal lands." Jacob felt cold dread spreading through his chest as he realized that their secret mission had somehow been discovered by authorities who possessed enough detailed information to track them to this specific location. Someone had betrayed their treasure hunting expedition, providing federal officials with intelligence that threatened to destroy everything they had risked their lives to accomplish. But before they could formulate any plan for dealing with the military presence outside their hiding place, a familiar voice joined the conversation taking place near their camp. Jacob recognized the speaker immediately, and the recognition filled him with a combination of rage and bitter understanding about how their secret had been exposed. The cave entrance is concealed behind the waterfall, exactly as I described in my report, Daniel Hayes announced to the assembled soldiers. Morrison and his Indian wife have been planning this treasure hunting expedition for months, using a legitimate railroad surveying contract to cover their real purpose in this region. Hayes was the traveling merchant who had provided them with information about Northern Pacific Railroad surveying opportunities during his visit to their ranch in November. Jacob now understood that Hayes had been far more than a casual source of business intelligence. He had been a federal informant, deliberately planted to gather information about suspicious activities by territorial residents who might be violating laws governing archaeological sites and Native American cultural artifacts. The betrayal was devastating, not just because it threatened their immediate safety, but because it revealed how thoroughly their activities had been monitored by authorities they had never suspected of taking interest in their personal affairs. Hayes had been collecting intelligence about their treasure hunting plans since their first conversations about surveying work, building a comprehensive case that would justify federal intervention and confiscation of any archaeological materials they might discover. "We need to surrender the gold and hope they allow us to leave peacefully," Jacob whispered to Running Bear as they heard soldiers beginning to organize a systematic search of the waterfall area that would inevitably lead to discovery of the cave entrance. But Running Bear's response surprised him with its fierce determination and refusal to accept defeat even in the face of overwhelming odds. "No," she replied quietly but with absolute conviction. "This gold represents the last hope my people have for maintaining any independence from federal control. I will not surrender it to the same government that has already stolen everything else my ancestors worked to preserve." Her words reminded Jacob that this treasure hunt had never been simply about personal enrichment. The gold represented the accumulated sacrifices of people who had died defending their way of life against systematic destruction. Surrendering it to federal authorities would constitute a betrayal of everything Running Bear's grandmother had lived and died believing about the possibility of preserving tribal culture for future generations. But the practical situation left them with few alternatives to peaceful surrender. They were trapped in a cave with limited escape routes, facing multiple armed soldiers who possessed legal authority to arrest them for federal crimes and confiscate any archaeological materials they had discovered. Resistance would likely result in violence that could cost them their lives without providing any meaningful protection for the treasure they had risked everything to recover. The conversation outside continued as soldiers organized their search. Procedures and Hayes provided additional details about Jacob and Running Bear's activities that revealed the extent of surveillance they had been under without their knowledge. Hayes had been reporting their movements, their equipment purchases, their conversations about surveying work, and apparently even their discussions about marriage and partnership arrangements. Morrison has been planning this treasure hunt since the day he married the Indian woman at that auction back in Redwood Creek. Hayes informed the soldiers with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a complex intelligence gathering operation. The whole surveying contract was just a cover story to get them access to this remote area during winter months when normal travelers would avoid the region entirely. Jacob realized that Hayes had been watching them far longer than they had suspected, possibly even influencing the sequence of events that had led to their marriage and treasure hunting partnership. The traveling merchant had been perfectly positioned to observe their activities, while appearing to provide helpful business information that actually served federal intelligence gathering purposes. But as soldiers began moving closer to the waterfall area, Running Bear suddenly grabbed Jacob's arm and pointed toward the rear of the cave where their torchlight revealed what appeared to be another passage, leading deeper into the cliff face. Her grandmother had mentioned multiple chambers connected by natural tunnels that could serve as escape routes for anyone who needed to leave the treasure cave without being observed from outside. "This way," she whispered urgently, gathering essential supplies while abandoning equipment that would slow their movement through narrow underground passages. "If we can reach the back entrance that grandmother described, we might be able to escape before they discover how to get into this cave." Jacob hesitated for a moment, understanding that following Running Bear into unexplored tunnel systems carried enormous risks of becoming lost, trapped, or injured in underground locations where no rescue would be possible. But the alternative was certain capture and the loss of everything they had worked to accomplish during months of preparation and weeks of dangerous travel. He grabbed the largest portion of gold that he could carry while still maintaining mobility for cave exploration, trusting Running Bear's knowledge of her grandmother's descriptions to guide them through passages that might lead to safety, or might prove to be dead ends that would trap them underground while soldiers secured the main cave entrance. The rear passage was smaller than the main chamber, requiring them to move in single file while carrying their precious burden through spaces that sometimes forced them to crawl on hands and knees. The tunnel wound through the cliff face in directions that seemed to follow natural fractures in the rock, occasionally opening into small chambers before narrowing again into passages that tested their courage and determination. Behind them, they could hear the sound of soldiers discovering the cave entrance and beginning their own exploration of the main chamber. Voices echoed through the stone corridors as federal agents examined the tribal artifacts and archaeological evidence that revealed the historical significance of the site they had discovered. But Running Bear pressed forward with the confidence of someone following a mental map inherited from generations of ancestors who had used these passages for purposes of survival and resistance. Her grandmother's descriptions proved accurate, guiding them through a maze of interconnected tunnels toward an exit that should emerge in a different valley system where their presence might not be immediately detected. The escape route required nearly 2 hours of difficult underground travel that tested both their physical endurance and their faith in Running Bear's inherited knowledge of the cave system. But eventually they emerged through a concealed opening in a cliff face that overlooked a narrow valley several miles from the waterfall area, where soldiers were still conducting their search operations. From their elevated position, they could see smoke rising from the area where federal agents had discovered their abandoned camp and were examining the equipment they had been forced to leave behind. But more troubling was the sight of additional riders approaching the search area from multiple directions, suggesting that Hayes had organized a comprehensive operation designed to prevent any possibility of escape from the treasure site. "They have surrounded the entire area," Jacob observed, as he counted the various groups of horsemen converging on the waterfall location. "Even if we had tried to surrender peacefully, they were prepared to treat this as a major federal operation rather than a simple archaeological violation." Running Bear studied the deployment of federal forces with eyes that reflected both anger and determination. "They came prepared for war against two people who were trying to recover what rightfully belonged to my family," she said bitterly. "This is how the government treats any attempt by Native Americans to reclaim what was stolen from us." But despite their successful escape from immediate capture, Jacob and Running Bear now faced the challenge of traveling through hostile territory while carrying enough gold to make them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams, but not enough to justify the destruction of their lives and the betrayal of everything they had built together during their brief but meaningful partnership. The weight of the treasure they carried represented both triumph and tragedy. They had successfully located and recovered a portion of the tribal gold that Running Bear's grandmother had died protecting, but they had also lost access to the majority of the treasure which remained in the cave system that was now under federal control and would probably never again be accessible to the people for whom it had been intended. More personally devastating was the realization that their marriage and partnership had been manipulated from the beginning by federal agents who had used their relationship to gather intelligence about Native American cultural activities that the government considered threatening to territorial security. The love and trust that had developed between them was real, but it had been built on a foundation of deception orchestrated by people who viewed their partnership as a potential source of intelligence about tribal resistance activities. "What do we do now?" Jacob asked as they began the dangerous process of traveling through mountain wilderness while avoiding federal agents, who would be searching systematically for any sign of their escape route. "We survive," Running Bear replied with the quiet strength that had first attracted Jacob's attention during that humiliating auction in Redwood Creek. "We use what gold we managed to save to build something that honors the memory of those who died, protecting it. And we prove that their sacrifices were not meaningless by creating a life together that serves purposes larger than personal comfort or safety." Her words reminded Jacob that their treasure-hunting expedition had always been about more than simple wealth acquisition. The gold represented hope for a future where Native American culture could survive federal policies designed to destroy traditional ways of life. Even the portion they had managed to rescue from federal confiscation could fund legal challenges, land purchases, and support systems that might make a meaningful difference for tribal communities struggling to maintain their identity and independence. But using the treasure effectively would require reaching safety, establishing new identities that would protect them from federal pursuit, and finding allies who could help them navigate legal and political systems that were designed to prevent exactly the kind of resistance activities they were planning to support. The immediate challenge was simply surviving long enough to reach civilization while carrying wealth that would make them targets for both federal agents and criminal elements who would not hesitate to kill for access to such a substantial fortune. They were alone in wilderness conditions that could prove fatal even without human threats, carrying responsibility for treasure that represented the hopes and dreams of people who had died believing their sacrifices would matter to future generations. As evening approached, Jacob and Running Bear established a temporary camp in a location that offered some protection from both weather and observation while they planned their next moves in a game that had suddenly become far more dangerous than either had anticipated when they first began dreaming about recovering tribal treasure hidden in the Montana wilderness. 6 months after their harrowing escape from the federal agents at the Waterfall Cave, Jacob and Running Bear sat on the porch of their new ranch house in Wyoming Territory, watching the sunset paint the prairie grasslands in shades of gold that reminded them both of the treasure that had transformed their lives in ways they never could have imagined. The weight they carried was no longer the burden of hidden gold, but the satisfaction of seeing their careful plans come to fruition, despite overwhelming obstacles that had tested every aspect of their partnership. The journey from Montana fugitives to Wyoming landowners had required every ounce of courage, intelligence, and determination they possessed. But more importantly, it had proven that the love and trust between them was strong enough to survive betrayal, pursuit, and the constant pressure of carrying secrets that could destroy them if discovered by the wrong people. They had emerged from their ordeal not just as survivors, but as true partners committed to using their unexpected wealth for purposes that honored the memory of those who had died protecting it. The transformation had begun during those desperate weeks immediately following their escape from the cave system, when they were forced to travel through wilderness conditions while avoiding federal search parties that seemed to anticipate their every move. Running Bear's knowledge of traditional survival techniques had kept them alive during the most difficult period, while Jacob's methodical approach to problem-solving had helped them develop strategies for reaching safety without being captured or killed. But their real salvation had come through an unexpected alliance with Marcus Thompson, a lawyer from Cheyenne who specialized in territorial land disputes and had built a reputation for helping clients navigate the complex legal requirements involved in establishing legitimate property ownership in frontier regions. Thompson had been recommended by a sympathetic Catholic priest who understood that Jacob and Running Bear needed more than legal advice to transform their stolen treasure into a foundation for building meaningful lives. Thompson proved to be exactly the kind of ally they needed. He possessed the technical expertise required to convert raw gold into legal tender, without attracting unwanted attention from federal authorities who might question the source of sudden wealth. More importantly, he shared their commitment to using money for purposes that extended beyond personal enrichment, having devoted much of his career to helping displaced Native American families acquire land and legal protection that would allow them to maintain cultural traditions while adapting to changing political realities. The lawyer had listened to their story with the skeptical attention of someone accustomed to evaluating complex legal situations, but he had also recognized the historical significance of the tribal treasure and the moral legitimacy of their efforts to recover what rightfully belonged to Native American communities. Under his guidance, they had established new identities as successful cattle ranchers who had accumulated wealth through legitimate business activities and wise investments in territorial land development. The process had required months of careful documentation, strategic property purchases, and patient construction of paper trails that would satisfy official scrutiny while concealing the true source of their financial resources. But Thompson's expertise in territorial law had enabled them to create legal foundations that transformed stolen treasure into legitimate wealth that could be used openly for whatever purposes they chose to pursue. Their new ranch in Wyoming territory encompassed nearly 5,000 acres of prime grazing land that supported over 1,500 head of cattle, making them among the most prosperous ranchers in the region. But more than personal success, the property served as headquarters for what had become an extensive network of support activities designed to help Native American families transition from reservation poverty to independent self-sufficiency. Running Bear had established a school where tribal children could learn both traditional cultural practices and the practical skills needed to succeed in white-dominated society. The curriculum included instruction in Native American languages, traditional crafts, and cultural ceremonies that were being systematically suppressed by federal policies designed to force assimilation into mainstream American culture. But the school also provided education in reading, writing, mathematics, and legal knowledge that would help tribal members protect their rights and interests when dealing with government officials, land speculators, and business representatives, who often took advantage of Native American inexperience with complex legal and financial systems. Jacob had focused his efforts on developing innovative agricultural techniques that could help tribal families establish successful farming operations on marginal land that was often the only acreage available for Native American ownership. His experiments with drought-resistant crops, efficient irrigation systems, and cooperative marketing strategies had produced methods that significantly increased the productivity of small-scale farming operations. The agricultural programs had proven so successful that several white farming families had requested permission to participate in the training seminars and cooperative purchasing arrangements that Jacob had developed specifically for Native American participants. The integration of different cultural groups around shared economic interests had created exactly the kind of positive relationships that both Jacob and Running Bear believed were essential for long-term peace and prosperity in the territorial regions. But perhaps their most important achievement had been the establishment of a legal defense fund that provided professional representation for Native American individuals and families facing discrimination, land disputes, or unfair treatment by territorial authorities. The fund had already successfully challenged several federal policies that violated treaty obligations and had helped numerous families regain access to traditional hunting and fishing. areas that had been illegally restricted by local officials. The legal victories had attracted attention from tribal leaders throughout the Western Territories, who recognized that Jacob and Running Bear had created something unprecedented in the history of white and Native American relations. Their success in using wealth strategically to advance Native American interests while maintaining positive relationships with white neighbors had inspired similar efforts in other regions, where tribal communities were struggling to preserve their culture and independence. Marcus Thompson had become far more than their legal advisor during the months of establishing their new life in Wyoming Territory. He had evolved into a trusted friend and partner in their efforts to use the tribal treasure for purposes that extended far beyond personal comfort or security. His legal expertise had been essential for navigating the complex regulatory environment that governed territorial business activities, but his genuine commitment to social justice had made him an invaluable ally in their broader mission of supporting Native American rights and cultural preservation. The transformation of their relationship from clients seeking legal protection to partners collaborating on social reform projects had created a powerful three-person alliance that combined Jacob's practical business skills, Running Bear's cultural knowledge and community connections, and Thompson's legal expertise and political contacts. Together, they had accomplished more in 6 months than any of them could have achieved individually over much longer periods. But the most profound changes had occurred in the relationship between Jacob and Running Bear themselves. The legal marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement and had evolved into genuine affection during their treasure hunting adventure had deepened into something that resembled the traditional tribal partnerships that Running Bear remembered from her grandmother's stories about life before reservation restrictions disrupted Native American family structures. They had learned to function as true partners in every aspect of their lives, sharing decision-making responsibilities, supporting each other through difficult challenges, and maintaining the kind of mutual respect that created space for individual growth while strengthening their collaborative effectiveness. The trials they had endured together had proven that their partnership could survive almost any external pressure while continuing to provide emotional satisfaction and personal fulfillment for both participants. The physical transformation in Jacob had been remarkable to observe. The confidence that came from Running Bear's unwavering faith in his abilities had motivated him to address health issues that he had ignored during years of social isolation and self-consciousness about his appearance. He had lost nearly 80 pounds through improved diet and regular physical activity, but more importantly, he had gained the kind of self-assurance that came from knowing he was valued for his character and capabilities, rather than judged solely on his physical appearance. Running Bear had also changed in ways that reflected her growing comfort with operating effectively in white-dominated social and business environments while maintaining her connection to traditional Native American cultural practices. She had learned to navigate complex legal and financial systems without compromising her core values or abandoning the spiritual beliefs that connected her to her ancestral heritage. The balance she had achieved between adaptation and cultural preservation had made her a role model for other Native American women who were struggling to find ways to succeed in territorial society without losing their identity or abandoning their community obligations. Her success in building bridges between different cultural groups while advancing Native American interests had earned respect from both white and tribal leaders, who recognized her unique ability to facilitate cooperation across traditional boundaries. The evening ritual of sitting together on their porch to watch sunset over the Fisa, Wyoming prairie had become a cherished time for reflection and planning that allowed them to maintain perspective on their Wyoming prairie had become a cherished time for reflection and planning that allowed them to maintain perspective on their remarkable journey from desperate strangers. At a humiliating auction to successful partners, leading efforts to transform territorial society in ways that benefited everyone involved. Tonight, as golden light spread across grasslands that now supported not just their own cattle, but also experimental crops and demonstration projects that were helping dozens of families establish economic independence. They felt the deep satisfaction that came from using their unexpected wealth for purposes that extended far beyond personal gain. But their peaceful evening was interrupted by the arrival of a rider, approaching their ranch house at the urgent pace that typically indicated important news or developing problems that required immediate attention. As the horsemen drew closer, they recognized Dr. William Harrison from Cheyenne, who served as their primary contact with tribal communities throughout the region, and who would only make the long journey to their ranch if something significant had occurred. Jacob and Running Bear, Dr. Harrison called as he dismounted near their porch, his face showing the mixture of excitement and concern that suggested he carried news of unusual importance. "I have information that will interest you both greatly, though it also creates new challenges that will require careful consideration and planning." They invited Harrison into their house, where he gratefully accepted coffee and a comfortable chair before explaining the purpose of his unexpected visit. The federal investigation of the Montana cave site had produced results that were both encouraging and troubling for their long-term security and for the broader cause of Native American rights that they had devoted their lives to advancing. The archaeological examination of the waterfall cave had revealed historical evidence that supported Native American claims to traditional territories throughout the northern Rocky Mountain region. Harrison began, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone delivering welcome news. "The artifacts and cultural materials that your people preserved in that cave system have provided legal documentation that several tribal communities can use to challenge federal land policies and treaty violations." But the investigation had also revealed the extent of Daniel Hayes' informant activities and had exposed a systematic federal surveillance program that had been monitoring Native American communities and their white supporters for potential resistance activities that might threaten territorial security policies. The exposure of the surveillance network had created political embarrassment for federal officials, but it had also identified Jacob and Running Bear as significant figures in what government authorities considered a potentially dangerous movement toward Native American independence. "We have received unofficial word that federal marshals may be planning to pursue charges related to the treasure removal," Harrison continued, his expression growing more serious as he addressed the potential legal threats they still faced despite their successful establishment of new identities and legitimate business activities. The warning was troubling but not unexpected. Jacob and Running Bear had always understood that their theft of the tribal treasure could eventually result in federal prosecution if authorities decided to pursue the matter aggressively. But they had also hoped that their transformation into respectable Wyoming ranchers and their obvious contributions to regional economic development might provide some protection against prosecution for crimes committed under very different circumstances. Thompson believes he can defend against any federal charges by arguing that the treasure rightfully belonged to Native American communities and that removing it from federal custody was an act of cultural preservation rather than theft. Harrison explained, "But such a defense would require revealing your true identities and acknowledging your connection to the Montana treasure site. The choice was between maintaining their current security through continued concealment of their past activities, or accepting the risks involved in public acknowledgement of their treasure hunting expedition in order to establish legal precedents that could benefit other Native American communities facing similar challenges with federal cultural policies." Running Bear considered the alternatives carefully before responding with characteristic determination and wisdom. "My grandmother always taught me that some things are more important than personal safety," she said quietly. "If acknowledging what we did in Montana can help other tribal communities recover what belongs to them, then we must be willing to accept whatever risks that acknowledgement creates." Jacob agreed completely with her assessment of their moral obligations. The treasure had never been about personal enrichment, and using it to benefit Native American communities had always been their primary goal. If their success in Wyoming could inspire and support similar efforts by other people, then the risks of public exposure were worth accepting for the potential benefits to tribal communities throughout the Western Territories. Thompson has also suggested that going public with your story could help build political support for broader reforms in federal Native American policies. Harrison added, "There are congressional representatives who are already questioning current approaches to tribal sovereignty issues, and your success in building cooperative relationships between white and Native American communities could provide powerful evidence for alternative approaches." The possibility of influencing federal policy through their example was both exciting and daunting. Jacob and Running Bear had focused their efforts on local and regional activities that could produce immediate benefits for individual families and communities. But if their experience could contribute to systemic changes that would help Native American communities throughout the country, then expanding their activities to include political advocacy would be a natural extension of their existing mission. Over the following weeks, they worked with Thompson and Harrison to develop a comprehensive strategy for going public with their story, while maintaining maximum protection for their legal interests and personal safety. The approach would involve coordinated media interviews, congressional testimony, and publication of detailed accounts that would provide both historical documentation and practical guidance for other people interested in pursuing similar activities. The public response to their story exceeded everyone's expectations for both positive support and hostile criticism. Newspaper coverage throughout the Western Territories portrayed them as everything from heroic defenders of Native American rights to dangerous criminals who had stolen federal property and should be prosecuted to the full extent of territorial law. But the most important response came from tribal communities throughout the region, who recognized that Jacob and Running Bear had accomplished something unprecedented in the history of white and Native American relations. They had successfully recovered tribal treasure, used it to benefit Native American communities, and established the kind of cooperative relationships that offered hope for peaceful coexistence, based on mutual respect rather than federal domination. Congressional hearings on territorial Native American policies featured testimony from Jacob and Running Bear that provided detailed evidence about the effectiveness of approaches based on partnership rather than paternalistic control. Their success in building profitable businesses while supporting tribal cultural preservation had impressed even critics who had initially questioned their methods and motivations. The federal charges that Harrison had warned them about were ultimately dropped when political pressure from congressional supporters made prosecution impractical for authorities who were already facing criticism about their handling of Native American issues. The decision reflected recognition that pursuing the case would create more problems than it would solve for federal officials, who were trying to develop more effective approaches to territorial governance. But more importantly, the publicity surrounding their case had inspired similar efforts by other individuals and communities, who recognized that creative approaches to tribal sovereignty issues could produce results that traditional methods had failed to achieve. Their example had demonstrated that cooperation between different cultural groups was not only possible, but could be more effective than conflict for advancing everyone's interests. As autumn arrived in Wyoming Territory, bringing the kind of crisp air and brilliant colors that made prairie landscapes look like paintings created by master artists, Jacob and Running Bear reflected on the remarkable transformation their lives had undergone since that humiliating auction in Redwood Creek, where their partnership had begun with a $2 bid that nobody else was willing to make. The treasure they had recovered from the Montana cave had indeed made them wealthy, but the real treasure had been discovering that two people from completely different backgrounds could build a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and commitment to purposes larger than personal comfort or security. Their success had proven that love could transcend the artificial boundaries created by prejudice and ignorance, and that cooperation could accomplish more than conflict for solving the complex problems that challenged territorial communities. The ranch that sprawled around them supported not just their own prosperity, but also the dreams and aspirations of dozens of families who had found in their example the inspiration and practical support needed to build better lives for themselves and their children. The school, the agricultural programs, the legal defense fund, and all the other activities they had established would continue growing and expanding long after they were gone, creating permanent improvements in the lives of people who might otherwise have remained trapped in poverty and hopelessness. But perhaps most importantly, they had demonstrated that the American dream of opportunity and success was available to everyone willing to work for it, regardless of their background, appearance, or the circumstances that had shaped their early lives. The obese rancher who had paid $2 for a woman nobody else wanted had discovered that real wealth came not from accumulating money, but from building relationships based on love, trust, and shared commitment to making the world a better place for everyone. Running Bear Morrison and Jacob Morrison sat together on their porch as evening settled over Wyoming territory, watching stars appear in skies that stretched endlessly toward horizons that no longer seemed to limit the possibilities available to people brave enough to pursue their dreams regardless of obstacles that might appear impossible to overcome. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve the communities and causes they had devoted their lives to supporting. But tonight they were simply two people who had found in each other everything they had never dared to hope they might discover. The treasure had been real, hidden behind a waterfall in Montana mountains, where it had waited for decades to fulfill the purposes for which it had been preserved. But the greatest treasure had been learning that love and partnership could transform even the most unlikely people into forces for positive change that would influence their communities for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.